Pleasure to find Scott there. Here we go, recording. Got it. Now, Scott and I are actually pals from another world in the streets and beaches of West Marin too. So it was great to find him, to be able to publish him in this journal as well.
Also don't have college.
All right. So now we've hit noon, so give it a few minutes here. Trying to think if there's anything I should say otherwise in this that we shouldn't wait for.
Well, Steve, if you would, I mean, let's give a little context for this particular version of the journal, and kind of why now, and sort of what the thought was, and or part of the guiding sort of context for the essays that were chosen.
Well, I mentioned Dave Smith. It's an interesting, the last two issues of the journal, which is now in its 93rd year, I believe, that the Medical Society has published, have had at least a special section focusing on a particular specialty and issues. And we kind of do this, at least from my point of view, to promote that specialty that we feel is, newer and neglected. The one before was addiction medicine, and now this one and palliative care. And we had the first ever palliative care physician as president of the Medical Society, Dr. Schaulis. So it seemed like a natural. And the great thing, at least logistically, about it was we just put out the word to her colleagues, and we had a immediate almost roster of great people willing and eager to write about it. So it's, bragging, right? But I think it's a really great issue of the journal with the wide variety of perspectives in there, from people who are basically considered co-founders of the specialty to newer ones. So it has historical perspectives. It's got ones from particular communities, people writing about Native Americans, about Asian, African American, that kind of thing, and then stories from the trenches. Reflections on some of the more emotional issues that come up. So, it's really broad in that way, and people did a great job, the authors among there. And so it came together really nicely. And we were thinking at some point of doing an actual CME medical meeting. That didn't really come together, primarily due to COVID, I would say, since that's been such a restriction on all kinds of meetings. And I just figured with this group, there'd be interest in this particular topic and this edition. And having been part of this group since the start, co-founding it. And, our group here, as you've heard from those who have heard the introductions, is quite diverse in background as well. And I've told this story probably too many times, but we have new people here. So the SFEOL was founded 3 years ago.
23, yeah.
Yeah, and the first 8 or so years, it was hosted by, held at the Medical Society itself, when we had a nice mansion on Sutter Street to do that and have lunches and everything. And that was always fun, but what I really remember most, I always remember, is our wonderful receptionist, after everybody had come through, and it was leaving after that, she said repeatedly, "That Death for Lunch bunch group are the nicest people who come into this building," right? And so it always stuck with me, because this group of people has been such an inspiring group and warmly received. And these meetings are serious but informal, which is cool. I like that. So the journal is out, it's posted. I hope you've all had a chance to take a look at it. And so what we were going to do here is have Monique and I have a little dialogue, and then and then some open Q&A if we can do that. So I'll leave it to Nate, when you're the chair here, when you really want to get going on that. We're just 5 after only, so. And I could say, there is a whole series of talks. There's a whole section on the Commonweal site, the Commonweal New School site. And there is an entire section of end of life related topics as well, which, everybody from some of the people have been here, and some of our, Frank Ostaseski, the founder of Zen Hospice, where a lot of us have worked. I spent a lot of time there years ago and served on the board, and even followed him up as the director for a little while. So that one, the last one we did in person, I believe, before, or one of the last before COVID, has now been viewed 16,000 times on YouTube, which shocked me. I would have worn shoes if I knew that was going to happen during that talk. But BJ Miller, who has a piece in the journal, he's been a speaker there more than once, and quite a few other people as well. All right, Nate, it's a little bit.
Let's go ahead and let's go for it.
Okay, so let's go to our main guest here today, who is Dr. Monique Schaulis, who is an emergency and palliative care physician at Kaiser here in San Francisco, and the immediate past president of the San Francisco Marin Medical Society. And as I just mentioned, we put together a journal here. She was the primary contact for getting all these great authors. So we figured we'd have a little talk about palliative care more in general, and then some of the specifics as well. So what I wanted to start with, Monique, and you're muted, so you should unmute yourself there, is your elevator speech. You walk into an elevator, somebody, it could even be a doc, because as we have agreed, a lot of physicians are still not so clear on what palliative medicine really is. So if you were to walk in and somebody say, hey, well, what is that anyway? What's the elevator speech? What palliative medicine is?
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I have a flyer that I have actually by my phone here in the office. And it's not bad. It says palliative care, specialized care for people with serious illnesses at any stage and any age. The goal is to improve the quality of life for the patient and for their family. The team consists of a doctor, a nurse, social worker, and chaplain. It's focused on providing an extra layer of support alongside someone's primary provider, which can be combined with curative treatments. I think that's not bad. It's not a super sexy way to say it, but I do think it's fairly accurate. And I think, I like to focus really on the extra layer of support, because I think that it can mean so many things to so many different people and in so many different ways. So, for some person that might be a focus on pain management or symptoms, and for someone else, it might really just be supporting their family with how to take care of them when they get home. For other people, it might be ending their lives with an ingestion of end-of-life medication. So I think it's just, it's so varied, so beautiful. One of the pieces I love in the journal, actually, I think we put it first, Steve, is palliative care as, what did she call it, Steve? It was like the cure for medicine, or the—
Yeah. With the focus on peds too.
Yeah. And so, I think what it really is, in my mind, is it's actually the kind of medical care we actually all want, not only when we're seriously ill, but when we're ill at all, and perhaps even when we're well, which is really focused on your goals, your priorities, and with a great emphasis on listening and communication. So I think, there's lots of ways to pitch that in the elevator, Steve, but that's mostly what I say. And I think, some families are much more interested in things like symptoms, and that might be a way in the door for people that are hesitant about thinking about the bigger picture.
That's kind of interesting to hear. I mean, from that description, wouldn't it be kind of logical to say that you're describing what all medicine should be to at least some degree?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the subspecialty is called hospice and palliative medicine. So just to be clear, a lot of people think that palliative care is only for dying people, but that's not true, right? It's much broader than that.
Yeah, we hope it's not. We're always happy to help out and are often called upon and into the days before dying. But we hope actually that we can get involved and develop relationships much earlier than that, months or years before we get to that time, so that when that time comes, it's less stressful, less burdensome, and we can be there really to support people as they go through what can be some of the most difficult times of their lives. I think establishing relationships is a big part of that as well. So the longitudinal care is really important.
So when I first met you and we talked about this, and you wrote about it, you even mentioned this in your introduction. Some would say that your specialty of emergency medicine and palliative care are, and some might be seen as polar opposites in terms of the amount of focus and the amount of time you spend and so forth. Lonnie's is an emergency physician as well. So, I mean, how did you first really get involved in becoming also trained and focusing on palliative care?
Well, it's funny you shared that. I mean, Lonnie is an emergency physician. Scott Schmidt is also an emergency physician.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So we've got three of us in the room, maybe someone else, I don't even know. But I think for me, it was really getting out into the real world. I trained at Highland, which is the county facility in Oakland. And I learned really a lot about keeping people alive. And then I got to the regular or other, I got into Kaiser, and I realized that I just didn't have the tools, because when people are well taken care of during their lives, what you end up with is often a bunch of chronic illnesses. And I often saw myself just sort of admitting the same people to the hospital, because that was really the only tool that I had. All right. It was either admit, discharge, but sort of this cyclical failure to improve. And so I really just felt like I wasn't doing the best that I could. I felt like I needed to learn more about how to have conversations about living with serious illness, about how things would change with serious illness, how to continue to live, rather than just the question of sort of living and dying. And so that's why I said to myself, you don't have the skills, you need to learn some more. And there were very few people, and still are kind of not that many people who have this background. But I think in the ER, we see a lot of failures, I think, of the system overall. We see people that are suffering, we see people that are dying for all different types of reasons. And it wasn't part of the training to really figure out how to talk to people about what's happening. It was sort of like, well, you're either a nice person or you're not a nice person, but rather than sort of any official training to really support people and explain well what's going on. So it was very, I think, organic approach. I think I probably talked to many people, and this is probably the origin really of being able to get so many great people for the journal, is that I just started talking to people. Like, how do I do this? How, BJ and I actually went to grade school together, and I said, BJ, like, what do I do? Something's wrong here. How do I approach this? So I had a lot of mentorship really along the way to sort of guide me. And I didn't do a fellowship in palliative medicine, but I did the grandfather approach, which involves a lot of sort of on the ground training, and did some training at Harvard through the PSEP program, as well as Vital Talk, which I think we're going to talk about later, which is a program really designed to teach physicians how to communicate better.
Yeah, in Steve Panelat's piece from UCSF in there, he talks about this too, about first hearing the term in the late 90s at UCSF and, basically starting anew as a new concept and name for it and having some, resistance in terms of formalizing the programs. You are at a large system here, and I think you've been pretty instrumental in spreading the concepts there. What have been the main? Have you had obstacles, and how are you doing that within a large healthcare system such as Kaiser?
Well, it's definitely been a journey, Steve. I think, and as I said, one of my mentors was Jeff Bean, who was a palliative physician at Kaiser, really the only one. And he died. And so then we sort of had a big lull, but he was doing that kind of work alone for many years. And
I remember him. Great guy. Yeah.
Yeah, great guy, of course. And I think there was a lot of alone time, feeling like things weren't, the system wasn't working for this kind of care. And I think things have really changed in the last 10 years. Actually, one of my, I think, most favorite things has been being introduced to Scott Schmidt, who was another emergency and palliative physician, kind of doing his own thing at his institution, but without a lot of peers. And so we were able to really band together and actually sort of achieve a lot more together, than just sort of on our own. But I think, one of my colleagues said, to me, it's all about timing. And I think, being an early adopter in this area was tough, because you would have these conversations, or I would have these conversations in the ER. But if I'm not speaking the same language as my doctors that are admitting or the ICU, then it just doesn't really work very well. So I think there's been a huge change in the level of institutional commitment to palliative care, to communication. And so I think it's really starting to catch up. I think, one example of that is recently there was a position created called Palliative Care Catalyst. And so that's my newest job title. And it's similarly kind of funny, right? Because that's a very odd name, right? For
it's a great one. Catalyst is a great thing.
Right. It's something that makes a chemical reaction go faster, right? And so I think the fact that they're supporting that kind of position is really indicative of the increase in understanding of the value of palliative care and the value of kind of integrating this approach into care in general. So it's probably dramatically different. Although I have to say, I still, there are still plenty of physicians and administrators who do continue to have, those ideas of 10 years ago of how do you do emergency and palliative medicine together, and I feel like the answer is better. That's what you get when you put more skills into each specialty. So trying to kind of spread that vision, being an ambassador, I think, to different specialties of how this helps patients and families. But actually, I think also one thing that I think is pretty important, it is like that first article in the journal, it is a little bit of an antidote to feeling like you can't be a good doctor, or, that you're kind of caught up in the system of medicine and can't have those kind of really important moments for feeling professionally satisfied and like you're doing the right thing. And so I think there's just a lot more recognition of that at this time.
Is it exaggerating, or is it okay to refer to it as something of a movement within medicine?
Well, I don't think it's exaggerating at all. I mean, I think it is.
I didn't think so.
That's a silly question, Steve. You know that. It clearly is a cultural transformation for medicine, moving away from what we got into earlier in the century, which was really about technology in a lot of ways, and moving back to much more, I think, humanistic approach to medicine, recognizing the failures of adopting, more technology as better care.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can just tell you from a few decades now on ethics consult service at Sutter and CPMC, the difference of having a palliative care team available for consults in end of life issues in particular has been a game changer. It's just that's one of the first questions that is asked if you have a very difficult patient where there's conflict and among the even staff, but family as well, is has there been a consult? So it's I think it's a remarkable improvement, and I hope that it keeps going in that way. I want to ask you about a specific, more clinical focused issue, the issue of pain control and relief. I'm just wondering, this has been such a controversial and difficult problem through the decades of undertreated pain, and then the swing to over treatment, and if you want to call it that, with opioids, and then back and forth. And I'm wondering if a lot of the patients that you see that is a primary consideration that you have to confront and adjust and deal with.
I think I'm actually quite sheltered from that issue due to my practice location, in San Francisco and at Kaiser. I think the organization has done an excellent job of working on opioid management and setting expectations and supporting physicians not to prescribe and to prescribe appropriately. And so I feel like I'm quite sheltered really from those issues. When I'm thinking about the patients though that I benefit most, it's not patients that primarily have pain. This is the inpatient setting. It's really the patients, I think, with kind of multiple issues. And so I think, it is sometimes the hospitalists will call me about, a pain question, and I can answer that, but depending on the type of patient, I might actually ask them to see the pain specialist instead of me, unless there's a needs an extra layer of support with the cancer or the family or the where are we going after the hospital type of thing. So I think whereas some palliative care has to sort of defend themselves against becoming, the primary pain managers, I think we've actually done a pretty good job of kind of setting the right expectations for what palliative care is and what palliative care isn't. Like, we're not doing chronic back pain and that type of thing.
Central issue is good communication, and you mentioned Vital Talk, and you want to say something about how that organization functions, what their goals are, and what you've been doing with them?
Sure. So Vital Talk, thanks Nate for popping that into the chat. Vital Talk is a nonprofit that, and Scott, correct me if you're still here and I say anything wrong. We've both been very involved for the last, I think, 10 years or so. It's a nonprofit, and their goal is really to teach serious illness communication to physicians so that physicians and patients have better relationships. And it's a very structured approach to communication. It's actually, studied and scientifically based. And so it's a quite intensive program that physicians and now it's moved on to, chaplains, social workers, the whole nurses, the whole support team to take them through fairly intensive courses. The minimum course is really like 4 hours where we really work together in person when possible, now online, to practice the skills needed for effective communication. Scott and I actually, I want to say in 2015 or so, we created a program for emergency physicians based on the Vital Talk model, and Vital Talk supported us to do that because we felt like our specialty, we're sort of a tribal specialty, just like many specialties, but you can't really kind of walk into an ER and, as a palliative care doctor and just be like, oh, I've got the perfect tools for you to communicate better with your patients. It's much better received as sort of a coming from within type of thing. So we created a program called EM Talk, which is really about teaching emergency physicians how to have those tough conversations quickly, compassionately, and in a way that works for them to do the important work, but not, set unrealistic expectations like, you have to have an hour to have this conversation with this family and make these types of decisions, but to come up with phrases, cases that work for us. And so there's been a huge growth in Vital Talk really over the last 5 years in particular. Many physicians and other types of providers getting trained to use these skills. So that's one thing we are actually working on at Kaiser is having these larger training courses for many physicians, and that really has been successful at doing what I was talking about at the beginning, which is, I have the first conversation in the ER, then the hospitalist has the second round of that conversation, or the ICU doctor, but it connects them because we're using the same framework and have sort of coming from the same place, using the same vocabulary and that type of thing. And so I think being able to launch those type of larger training courses and movements has been very successful.
The issue of medical aid in dying, of course, has been controversial. It was a long, drawn-out fight. You saw some of that within the medical association world, as though Monique has been part of our group that advocates for good policies through the CMA and so forth. But this was a long, drawn-out struggle to get the law changed here. And I know that you have been, and actually, you and I barted over to Lonnie's conference that was mentioned, the sold out conference together, to go to that back in a couple years ago. You have been, well, obviously pro-choice on this, but also I think integral at Kaiser in making this an optimally performed option there. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about what that has been like in the within that system and for you as a physician yourself.
Well, I think, it really started with some very high level support at the regional level at Kaiser. And I think what that has led to is an incredibly good program overall that is probably, I think, the best for patients who are looking for that option that exists. And I think it was really regional leadership that brought that thought that through so well and presented it so well to us, I think, at the beginning. And we actually we created models through the Vital Talk process for training physicians to have these conversations. And we really continue, I think, to do peer mentoring that I think is really probably the best way to allow physicians to really just explore this like little by little so they feel more comfortable. And that's really, I think, been the process. So I'm also the physician lead for South San Francisco for end-of-life options. And that's what we do is sort of one by one, create a team, create a process for what happens, how do we do this together, and really have been able to be able to efficiently and compassionately get people the care that they're looking for. And I think also, of course, Lonnie has been a huge support for Kaiser, for me, for all of this. I think in the foreground and in the background for all of these years. And that conference was really, I think, integral to this work in the Bay Area. So I want to just thank you again, and thanks for contributing to the journal. I think, there are still issues, there are still issues with all of with end of life options really almost everywhere. And I think, we continue to focus on how to improve the quality of care. And I think, for example, we just have been working on processes to try to get people medications or people through the process a lot faster, given SB 380. And so those are just ways we've been really trying to keep up. And, we've also adjusted medications really based on mostly on Lonnie's work, and been able to make those changes at a systemic level that I think just has been fantastic. Where did we start, Steve? What was the question?
Well, I'm wondering if, two things really, I guess. If you started on that, you've been doing that, about how many patients have completed that process at this point through Kaiser there, if you're aware of?
Oh gosh, I don't even know. You mean the whole region, maybe?
Well, yeah, whatever, but I mean, it's a lot, right? I mean, it's not.
It's absolutely a lot.
Yeah, so you have some accumulated experience, and I'm just wondering, if there's been any striking, any surprises or lessons that have come out of that experience, from when you were going in.
I think there's still a fair amount of issues around the logistics that are still a little troublesome to sort out. Because so many people are debilitated at the time of ingestion, they may not have a place where they're independently living. And so I think one of the recurring struggles has really been what to do about people who live in a nursing facility, what to do about people who live in a boarding care. I've seen people like transferred around the city to go home and ingest, and then they're too sleepy when they get there. People who go to a boarding care want to ingest, the boarding care says, no way, over my dead body, you're going to ingest here. All of those types of things. And I think they're sort of settling down, but I think there's still kind of an opacity to the whole process and the rules around it that is interestingly unsolved. And so, that's one thing that I always make sure I talk about with patients, especially in the hospital, is, let's make sure that the place you're planning on receiving your care, or the place you're planning on living, is somewhere that will allow you to do this if that's important to you. And it's not actually that easy to get the information. It's you call, and depends on how you talk to sometimes, and it's really it's not very patient-centered in that way. So I think that's something as a community that we can advocate for is if people demand that this is available in these locations, it's probably going to help, because the board and cares this is how they make their living, is taking care of people. So if they're not going to their locations because of an issue like this, they may change their policy. And I think we've seen that a little bit, but not as much as I would hope over this time. I feel like I'm still it's definitely better, but still there's issues. I'm sure you guys have a ton of experience with these types of things, but I'm happy to report I haven't had a patient go to a hotel recently. I always really felt like that was almost unbearable to me to know like my patient was going to go to a hotel to take medication. It seemed unbearable for the patient. It seemed unbearable for the hotel staff. Just didn't really pass muster, for me. And so, I know there's been a lot of work by many, many people to avoid that type of thing, but still probably more to do.
Yeah, we did publish in the journal a very brief summary of the changes in the law that have happened to help streamline it a little bit. And I think there's more to be done. Might be a good time to actually go to Lonnie Shabelson, Dr. Shabelson, if you would unmute yourself. Because talk about a catalyst. This is somebody who for decades has worked on this. And, from, I think we met through, he wrote a book about walking through a few patients about this final choices long ago. And I reviewed it for the Chronicle. And I think we met through that. And then we ended up some years later actually publishing clinical guidelines for assisted dying in a medical journal. And one of the memorable things about that is the front page New York Times story was titled Guidelines for the Unthinkable. So here we are, this much later thinking and actually working on this. So Lonnie, you wrote in the journal. Thanks for that. And what would you like to tell us?
Yeah, first thanks for inviting me to the journal article. That was kind of fun to do and a good venue. And Monique, it's really interesting to hear your perspective from Kaiser. I think you're right. I mean, Kaiser is the sort of the frontier organization that took this on an institutional level. And that's been wonderful to watch, with lots of hiccups along the way, as large institutions will have, that I've watched them get ironed out. But maybe to provide a bit of an overview about how much medical aid in dying has changed in barely 5 years. It's been in practice for 25 years in various states. But we have, I think, finally moved from this being a practice focused on the law. You have to be over 18. You have to have a terminal illness with less than 6-month prognosis, 2 doctors, the following forms, et cetera, et cetera. And the way it's been taught has been almost like we were teaching a law school class rather than we're teaching a medical school class. And what has changed since the advent of the academy and since California is the largest state to take this on, and with good clinicians like Monique and Scott and me and all sorts of other people out there working on this, we've kind of wrestled this into the ground and wrestled with this and made it into a clinical practice, not a legal practice. And so the question of good medical care, sound medical judgment, how do we work with people's requests? How do we provide palliative care and work with hospices and integrate medical aid in dying and work with difficult prognoses, and as Monique brought up, really some tough social situations, family dynamics and conversations, and all of that has nothing to do with the law. It's got to do with good medical practice. And I think what we've seen, the most significant change has been towards moving this towards clinical medicine. That's why we're the American Clinicians Academy on Medical Aid in Dying, and why I spend half of my time explaining that we don't advocate for medical aid in dying at the Academy. We're not an advocacy organization. We just say that if people are going to participate in medical aid in dying, or as I like to say, consider medical aid in dying, because it's one of many options. And so to consider medical aid in dying, we just want that to be done well, like any other part of medicine, like emergency medicine, cardiology, whatever. We have an academy, we have data-driven information. We teach clinicians to clinicians, not just aspects of the law, and we don't advocate. We take care of patients. And I think that's been a very major change in the clinical practice of medical aid in dying, that somehow, when I started in 2016, we all remember June 9th, 2016, launching into this world of medical aid in dying in California, nobody had any idea what they were doing. Literally, myself in my practice, I didn't know it. There were some mentors that we had from Washington and Oregon, but the practice there looked very, very different than the way it evolved in California. And I think we've learned a lot, we've shared a lot, we've put ourselves on the map, and we've moved into being caring clinicians rather than advocates, lawyers, and legislators running the show. And that's been a really major shift. So if I had to say there's an overview, I think that's been the overview of the change has been on that basis. Really data, best practices, data-driven, compassionate patient care. And then if I can be the curmudgeon that I tend to be, that brings me to writing articles like The Myths About Medical Aid in Dying, which, you guys in your journal were kind enough to let me spout off on that, which is, I think at times we overstate our case, which is the term, for example, death with dignity, as if, you all know, if I say, I want death with dignity, I'll bet that most of you immediately think I'm talking about medical aid in dying, as if a dignified death is now synonymous with medical aid in dying, and how silly that is. Deaths with dignity happen all the time, independent of medical aid in dying or with it. We're just one tiny part of dignified deaths. People get to choose deaths with dignity by their own terms, and we're another option, but good palliative care hospice deaths are deaths with dignity. I would even argue that a death on a ventilator in the hospital when you're suffering from cancer and it's a Hail Mary pass, if that's your way of saying that you want a death with dignity, then that's the way you die with dignity. So I think we've overstated our case by using the political term. It's very, very good on a political advocacy level, but I think we should stop saying death with dignity. We don't own dignified deaths, and we should give it back to who it belongs to, which are the people who are dying. In the same sense, I think that we have to be careful about this, what I've come to call the misery versus mercy mythology, which is, and I just, somebody sent me another copy. People, have you all seen this George Will article in the Washington Post? And I just pulled it up on my screen, so if I'm staring in a weird place. The title is Medical Aid in Dying is for Preventing a Hideous Death, not for truncating an unhappy life. And that's such a good example of what I'm talking about in this misery versus mercy. A hideous death, was that the only thing that medical aid in dying is there for, is to avoid hideous deaths? Are we just going to frighten people into taking medications to die? Or are we going to use reasonable language like, hey, this is one of your options. I think that if you're considering medical aid in dying, let's talk about your issues. Let's figure out what's going on. I'm not going to be for it or against it, but I'm not going to tell you you're going to have a hideous death unless you have medical aid in dying. That's fear mongering, which is a very, very used and wonderful political advocacy tool, but it's a terrible clinical tool to tell somebody, for example, well, if you don't have an extra round of chemotherapy for your breast cancer, you're going to have this terrible breast pain and all things will go awful. We shouldn't be using fear. And I think we just need to be careful, as Steve, you used the term movement, which I'm not sure it still applies, but for medical aid in dying. But I do think that we have to be really careful about, now that we're a legitimate part of medical practice, about overstating our case. And so I'll leave it at that. Yeah. So Monique, I mean, we've talked about this many times and worked together for a long time. So it's great to see you here.
I think some of that language and that concept of the hideous or otherwise came out of the HIV era, that really fired this up, when there was no treatment and there were a lot of hideous deaths. And when I came to San Francisco and started working with AIDS patients, that's what I saw, and that's where I first got really kind of fired up about this as a choice, to avoid that. So I think you're right, though. It doesn't apply to the broad spectrum of the 100% of people who die eventually. Monique, do you have a comment on that, on what Lonnie said in any way before we go to somebody else?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I would say that's true in my practice as well, is that people expect death to be hideous. Right. Like, that's the cultural construct around death. And I'm talking to people in their hospital, and whatever, they're here for whatever condition, and we might be talking about palliative care or medical aid in dying, and they're like, when's the pain gonna come? When is it gonna get so horrible? And I said, well, I don't think you're gonna have pain. Your disease process is not a painful one, right? And people are shocked. They expect that almost no matter what, it's gonna be painful, and they're gonna be just suffering at the end of life. And it's just, I think it's part of the larger lack of experience with death that we have societally, that leads to those expectations, but probably also may have some component of that fear mongering that has happened, and perhaps that's had an influence as well. But yeah, it's quite interesting as to what people's expectations are.
Let's go to Scott Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt, if you want to unmute yourself. You are also at Kaiser, also emergency doc, and you wrote about the RESPECT project, which is of course related to mortality and such as well. So what would you like to say about that?
Well, first of all, Lonnie, thanks for your words. I'm glad to finally hear you talk about what you do. I've been hearing about your work for a long time, and it's great to hear your perspective and refreshingly honest and humble. Thank you very much. So yeah, this was what was in the journal, was an excerpt, actually, because I've known Steve and Monique for a long time. It was an excerpt from something I wrote for the journal a while back. And, you know, basically I was a hospice doctor and an ER doctor, and sort of through that process recognized enormous gaps in quality care at the very end of life in the emergency department. And when I transitioned from multiple gigs, multiple ERs to just working for Kaiser, I pitched them for combining my dual clinical expertise into something that I saw as an opportunity for improving how we take care of people in a dignified way at the very end of life. And so the RESPECT project basically came out of that, and is really has two limbs. One is kind of how do we be with people that have actually died, and the other is, you know, how do we care for people that are actively dying, whose focus in terms of personal values and goals is to die with dignity, to jump on that phrase, to focus on comfort only, and to then, you know, support caregivers, just to stick with this, like a, you know, to have a dignified experience of being healthcare providers to people that are dying, because you know, we I think as a field are short on training people to support people through the dying process. So the program was really about, you know, providing some tools and workflows for this moment that all of us one day will face, and you know, for those that face that in the tense environment of the emergency department. So that's what the RESPECT project is, and you know, that was something that we put together almost 10 years ago now. And since then, I, you know, have worked with Monique on many different projects in many different ways. And the latest iteration of which is really, I would say, kind of the child or grandchild of the RESPECT project, which for me was the biggest manifestation of the notion of primary palliative care, or palliative care provided by the non-palliative care specialist. And in that case, it was in emergency medicine. And in the Kaiser case, we are developing a kind of broader strategy for workflows that will support serious illness care across all settings and all disciplines. And the term that we're choosing to use is primary palliative care, but for this group, I imagine that's quite familiar terminology. But, you know, the focus on Vital Conversations is the Kaiser version of Vital Talk. Monique and I are teaching that, and we'll be scaling that in a big way. But, you know, the idea is that we want all clinicians to have these skills to be able to deliver serious news, to discuss prognosis, and to explore and clarify goals of care at any touch point where that is relevant. And so that's the big and ambitious prayer and goal that we're setting for ourselves. And we've got some work to do, but I'm loving doing it. And so anyway, thanks for having me. Those are a few thoughts. I don't know, Steve, if there's something else you want me to.
Well, no, it just sounds like you don't feel particularly schizophrenic about the emergency versus palliative care yourself anymore.
Well, no, I mean, I started in hospice in terms of diversifying my work, and everyone always said that if it doesn't go well in one field, I could, you know, pick them up in the other. So that was kind of the joke that my friends made. But no, it's actually, there are more and more of us. And just to add to what Monique said, you know, it came out of, for me, just feeling satisfied when I was able to really be there for someone confronting these questions and this moment of decision making and death, and also experiencing kind of some existential suffering of my own, knowing that when that conversation wasn't possible, that my hand would often be forced really to do things that I think patients and families, had they had some conversations earlier or more upstream, would not have wanted. And so that kind of led to, those pieces led me to explore it more deeply, and kind of had somewhat schizophrenic, like parallel worlds of being a hospice doctor and then doing ER shifts in the same week, to what I do now, which is, some limited clinical emergency medicine, but more strategic and administrative work with Kaiser to develop these strategies and programs to improve how we do this, which feels more integrated for me now, I guess.
Great. Well, thank you for that work and for contributing here too. Hospice has been mentioned. If we could go to Dr. Dawn Gross here. You want to unmute yourself? Thank you for joining us. Your piece focused on hospice care and issues. And so what would you like to tell us here today about that?
Well, I really appreciate what I've been hearing, and really so grateful, Monique, for your vision of this journal and the breadth of what you accomplished covering. It is really a gift to the community. So thank you for that. The piece that I wrote about hospice is actually one of my more grumpy, cantankerous forms of writing. When I talk about hospice, I've been practicing hospice and subsequently palliative medicine for just shy of 2 decades, and really approach palliative care from the hospice lens, as that was my introduction to the specialty. I was originally a hematologist and bone marrow transplanter, and even before that, I was a lab rat. I was a basic scientist. So came to practicing medicine in a very intimate way, quite unexpectedly. And what I've learned from being at the bedside of people who are keenly aware that they're dying is how profound each moment of life is, and how grateful they are when people take notice. And particularly the folks that I have been fortunate to care for, who are in the most vulnerable of situations. So particularly in county facilities where they may not have friends or family, or be estranged, and don't have a built-in sense of community. And what I've come to see is that the hospice team, which by design is a very interdisciplinary, multimodal team, envelops these people. We talk about how hospice provides a 360-degree form of care. We surround people and their family, however they define family, so that we can meet each of them where they are at any given moment and adapt. And what I found, particularly for people who are vulnerable, which is quite honestly just about anyone at the end of life, we are pretty vulnerable creatures. When they experience this kind of community, this kind of attention, and fundamentally this love, they quickly get attached. And one of the challenges is with the archaic structure of the hospice benefit right now, which has not evolved since its inception in the 80s. How we die has dramatically changed because of the advances in science and in healthcare delivery. And yet how we are allowed to support people at the end of life hasn't. And so what I mean by that is we are caring for people, we are becoming their family, we are being trusted and allowed to be intimate, only in some instances to have to go away because we are doing too good a job in caring for people. So they're literally not dying fast enough to meet qualifications to continue the support. And that's criminal as far as I'm concerned. My hope is that we evolve in our healthcare delivery models to a state where in truth hospice vanishes and it all becomes palliative care. And what I mean by that is palliative care has no limits on when it can be actually made available to people. That being said, hospice is the only structured financial model that pays for this type of care. And so the undercurrent is while palliative care is brilliant, it's completely chaotic in how it's delivered. So even within UCSF, where I practice palliative medicine, depending on what hospital site you are located, the palliative care team looks and behaves differently. Whereas if you go to any hospice provider, there is a core fundamental delivery system that is mandated by the Medicare benefit, because that's how they get reimbursed. So at some point, we need to merge these two. We need to unshackle hospice so it can actually continue to deliver care the way it's needed, the way that's desired, the way it makes a difference, while having a reimbursement model that actually can sustain palliative care. That's what I have to say.
Yeah, listening to that, and one of my roles in life is doing policy for really the AMA, going up to the AMA, and I'm thinking, maybe there's a resolution here. Monique would probably be great to join in on this. So I may be writing you very soon, and maybe we can come up with a good idea to, it's working within the system to actually change those kind of policies, and we have a track record of actually doing it, and the time is right on things. So thank you for that.
I can't agree more, Don. Right before I came in this room, I had a patient and we'd been talking about hospice, and then the clinical nurse specialist that I work with said, well, hospice doesn't think he was going to qualify. And I thought, so what does that mean for him? It means he doesn't get hospice support at home, and it means he has to make another round trip to the hospital until he's sick enough to qualify for the benefit. And so it's this inevitable, like, instead of being proactive and getting this guy the care he needs now, we have to cycle around the moon one more time, and so I can't agree more, and issues like dialysis they're just huge, and the way hospice is right now, it can't meet the need. The needs are huge. So I love the idea of, I think that advocacy is critical.
Yeah, I want to build on that, Monique, and that cycle you talk, one more time around the medical moon of healthcare as we've built it is so expensive, right? If we look at the cost, just money that's going to be put into that one cycle, versus if you poured that into just let hospice do its thing to avoid that, right? I know you don't need to get an MBA to know the economics of that. That being said, the emotional challenge, right? So we have families that are crystal clear. They don't want to do that cycle again. They're done. And if they live at home and they have the family, sort of sweat equity resource, meaning they have human power to support people at home, or they have financial power to hire other people to provide that human power to keep them at home, then that can work out, right? Because they're in charge of then when someone gets brought back into that cycle or not. And if that family or that individual is not able to be in their own home under their own power, and they are in an assisted living facility or a boarding care facility or a skilled nursing facility, the rules and regs overreach, right? And they say, we don't care. If anything happens to you, 911. You can have every form under the law that says don't do that, and they will override it. And you were thrust then back into this system of, even now I'll show up in the ER and I will have a post form that says, do not do that. And then the ER is like, well, then why are you here? And we have just spent $1,000+ in person hours and angst for what? And I toss that to the attorneys, which I know we have in the group, saying, what is that all about? When you say, I am saying, don't take me to the hospital, and I understand the risk benefit of that, and this is my preference. The only way to make that empowered in an assisted living or boarding care or skilled nursing facility is to have hospice. And if someone isn't quote unquote eligible because they're not dying fast enough, then they're stuck. And that is just heart-wrenching and wasteful in every measure of the term waste, if not downright damaging. So we have to solve that. We just can't keep letting this be oh, well, it's just the way it is. It's not okay. So I want to advocate, and I want to do that with really smart, eloquent people that won't get as uppity as me, because I'm just going to get emotional and
Yeah, it's something we've been hearing about for so long in various settings. And so, yeah, we'll have to think about what the actual practical changes could be in payment policies, et cetera, qualifications and protocols that would help with this. So thank you very much. Let's go to Dr. Jeff Newman, who actually wrote in the journal as well about the Palliative Care Task Force here in San Francisco, dealing with advanced care planning as well. Do you want to say a quick note about what you've been working on there and hoping to do?
Sure. We have been primarily focused on advanced care planning. So to intervene earlier with people with chronic disease and then advanced illness. And we're housed in the health department. And we're funded by the Stubbsky Foundation. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the husband, Mr. Stubbsky, died a week after being notified that he had a serious illness. This is a very affluent family. So it gives you an idea that for low income, low educational level, it's very hard for them to understand what their prognosis and course is going to be. But because of what happened to him, a lot of money from his foundation has gone to a bunch of the hospital systems, which built up their palliative care program. And we've been focused on the advanced care planning part of that. So as usual, healthcare in San Francisco is a tale of two cities, the rich and the poor, even though the Stubbskys were rich and they suffered from it. But the problems with advanced care planning and late palliative care are magnified in low income and diverse communities. And so that's what our most recent project worked on. We looked at the African American, the Latino, and the Chinese communities. And so we just, that's what I reported in the article in the journal, was the preliminary results of that. And so some of our findings in the huge Chinese community in San Francisco, there's a lot of language problems, including, I must say, we're hearing about it even in the hospital, because as I understand it, the way language services are being provided these days, it's like off-site, it's by telephone. And it really, what we heard is a lot of dissatisfaction with that. And also, there's a lot of cultural issues, like in the Chinese community, they want, the older parent wants their children to take over decision-making when they, that's what they want to prepare for. And there's a lot of concerns, and some of their children really don't understand and are not interested in doing that, even though we have great facilities working on this. In the African American community, there's a lot of course, suspicion about medical care, and especially palliative care, the idea that that would deprive them of real medicine. And so we focused a lot on addressing these cultural issues. Another group is the gay and lesbian community, where typically it's for young people, it's not their parents they want to be the alternative decision maker, it's their partner. And so this is the kind of thing that we've been focused in on our program. And it was very preliminary findings that I presented in that article, but we're now getting more serious. Stubsky is giving us increased funding. We're going to be recruiting a director, a half-time executive director for our program. And when that announcement comes together, I'd like to share it because you may know candidates for that. So that's where we are. And it brings a public, from my point of view, a public health approach to advanced care planning and palliative care to work together with the clinical approach that the rest of you all have been describing.
Thank you, Jeff. Great work. And, just last week, one of the boards still on the Chinese Community Healthcare Association, they announced Stubsky has given them a substantial grant coming out of this work. So I'm sure that was somewhat stimulated by the work that you're doing with the task force there. And it's interesting too, the lead on that, I believe, for that community is Dr. Joe Wu, who's an emergency physician. So I'm sensing a conspiracy here, of some kind.
he's been active with our group. We're very appreciative of that connection.
Yeah, no, he's a very active, he's a board member of the Medical Society too. So it was great to hear that as well. Monique, or actually I should ask Jeff, we go to 1:15, Jeff, another 7 or 8 minutes. I mean, I'm sorry.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
No problem. Monique, if that's okay with you, just a few more minutes. So we've heard all these great reflections here. Do you want to say something more about where this is going? Well, this is a weird question, I guess, but if you had a genie, you knocked over a genie and he gave you 1 or 2 or 3 wishes, where would you like the field to go in the next, whatever, decade or something like that? What would be your dream?
Well, I would grant Dawn her wish first.
We're gonna be careful what you say. We're gonna work on that. I think this is something we should pay some attention to.
I think it's a huge issue, and I think it's just sort of indicative of the money running the medicine, and so that's a huge issue on many levels, but this is certainly the one where we see it, I think, the most at end of life. Let's see. I think I think getting palliative care out into health systems generally, and to physicians and other providers to have the tools rather than just creating another silo is a critical part of its development too, because again, I think these are best practices for medicine in general. So taking these skills really to the streets, taking them to medical schools, to residencies, and making them just part of the core competencies and expectations for people who are practicing medicine. I mean, it's not really rocket science, or to know that these are critical and fundamental skills that aren't really being taught. And so I think that's happening little by little, but it's a lot easier to get the youth to adopt things if it's just part of school, rather than having to transform culture through people who've been living a certain way for a long time. What else? Steve, I know you and I have a lot of agreement. Why don't you give me one idea?
Well, I think that's one, the story I always tell when I've talked on this was that June day that Lonnie referred to when the EOLA bill was signed and it was legal. it was on the front page of the Chronicle, and I was just by chance was slated to give an ethics talk to freshman medical students at UCSF. And I was sitting in the cafeteria up there at Millbury, Parnassus, and I had the paper, and it was a big headline, and I was reading it and reading the great moving message that Jerry Brown as governor had signed when he signed this bill against great opposition from his Catholic, friends and upbringing. But there was a whole cadre of what looked like medical students, very young, and sitting there, and they were kind of I saw them trying to read the thing. What's that about? So I pulled it down and I said, okay, first quiz of the day for you guys. What do you think of this? And they all looked kind of confused, who's this guy in the cafeteria, et cetera. But one of them, guy said, well, can you explain to us first why that was illegal? And are we going to learn about this in school? So I think you're very right. I've come to think over my career, my life, is that real change on big issues is primarily generational. It's much harder to retrain people, although you can do it and you change minds. But the big movement on that topic actually was really allowing people to be honest about what they felt, because when we really polled, and I published the first poll of American physicians ever done, 30 years ago, and it had a big pro-choice, as you will, slant, which nobody, really believed before. So I think the training thing from, integrating it throughout training, starting in medical school, nursing school, et cetera, is very important. But the bigger, broader one, so we've got policy from Dawn at the Medicare, et cetera, label, and then training. The bigger one is maybe societal, and just in terms of really getting a lot more information and perspective and reality-based wisdom about mortality and end of life, and what to expect and what not to expect, and what to demand or not demand, realistic expectations, but just recognition of it. And, I do think when I talk to somebody like Frank Ostaseski, another pioneer, that is happening, and for all kinds of reasons, aging population and just getting it out there, but that would be my other one. Just, the continual erosion of the death denying culture that we've had, which is, part of it's just part of our psychology, the scary thing. But some places and peoples are better at it than we have been through the years. So some of that within medicine is moving away from the technology, that, oriented focus that Dawn mentioned and many have mentioned through the years. So.
I'm just going to add, in the meantime, that we really, our model is so designed about giving people what they don't need, and not giving them what they do need. And that's also financial, right? Caregiving is what they need. They need a way to help, to pay people to care for them. And that is not happening. And so that would be, I think, an extremely, you have to be so incredibly poor in order to have Medi-Cal pay for someone to take care of you. And I think that, the fact that so much of what I have to explain to people are their options have to do with the fact that they don't have money and they don't have someone to take care of them at the end of the life is just a travesty. To quote Dawn, it's criminal, that we allow this to happen, to people who have worked their whole lives. It's the basics that we're not meeting here. We don't, we're willing to pay how much to put them in the ICU, for 6 weeks of the last 8 weeks of their lives, but we're not willing to pay for someone to go feed them or clean them. It's just, so I'm adding that to the wish list. One thing I would mention is Jessica Zitter was also in the journal, and her film, Caregiver, A Love Story, would be a great link to send around to the group. I don't know if you guys have seen it already, but it's a very nice documentary about a woman who's on hospice and whose husband is taking care of her. So I'd highly recommend it for anybody that hasn't seen it.
Yeah, second that.
Could I just chime in for a moment, please? Is that,
Go ahead, Nancy.
so even though I wasn't invited, I'm just bursting to speak. So especially related to what Dawn was talking about, I, for several years, was the pediatric consultant for an in-home palliative care and hospice group called Comfort for Kids, which was wonderful in addressing a lot of the issues that Dawn talked about, because a child was eligible at the time of diagnosis with a life-threatening condition. And that meant several things. One, that often those kids got much better overall care, and the families did too, because they were both cared for at home and in the hospital. And we also knew them more intimately because we could go see them when they were hospitalized, like at UC, at CPMC, at Kaiser, but also be their home doctor. So there was that, it's a very almost like cliche phrase, but the seamless transition stuff and the seamless care is so important. The other thing is that with some of these families, we actually worked with them for like 5, 6, 7 years, so that it wasn't an abrupt transition and giving up hope when it switched to end of life care. It was just part of the continuum that was going on. So they weren't abandoned in the sense like Dawn talked about, where they would have to know one team and then drop that whole team very abruptly to go to the death team, as it were. Unfortunately, our culture isn't really ready for that. So it was not long-term supported administratively and then financially. So that organization doesn't exist. But I wholeheartedly concur and have had the experience of working in the system, which can work a whole lot better than it does. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy, for that.
Said Nancy.
So I want to thank all of our authors, speakers who joined in here with this unknown group here, and particularly Monique for joining us here too. And I'm going to turn it back to Nate to sign us off. But thank you all very much for being here today. And I'm really glad we recorded this. Great idea, Nate, because I think we posted up. We'll get a lot of people looking at this.
Thank you. 30 seconds before we run. So in the spirit of BJ, who was writing on aesthetics, let's turn from the technology side to, well, to art. You can see we've got harps and guitars and all kinds of things behind me. My kids are learning a whole bunch of things, but I just wanted to just say, and I think on behalf of everybody that's heard the authors speak here, just how the tremendous gratitude that we have for each of you. And it really, you know, when I think about Scott's article, which by the way, Scott, I assigned this journal to my nursing students. I have almost 200 this semester, and Scott's article actually was the one that was the most chosen to write on. So this respect, this acronym as it breaks down, these are nursing students, and it's, you know, but when you look at the map of respect, or you look at Vital Talk and these principles, you know, it's almost like looking at a musical score, and you can see the complexity, but the performance is really often in the virtuosity of the performer. And you all bring these scripts to life in ways that we're just so lucky and grateful to have right in our backyard. And just wanted to just shore you up and just say how much we love, appreciate, and are grateful to each of you for what the work that you're doing and what you're advocating for. And just thank you for spending your very, very precious time with us today too as well. And just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's good to see everybody. So we'll have an opportunity to meet again first Wednesday of next month in March. And until then, take good care, everybody.
Yeah. Happy Groundhog Day, whatever that is, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.